The diplomat's failure. There is a reason that Niman carries a reputation of weakness, a reason the name itself, the diplomat's form, has become synonymous with compromise. When people speak of Niman, they talk about the Jedi, they talk about the order that practice it for centuries, and somehow managed to make mastery look like mediocrity. But what if the form was never the problem? What if it was the Jedi who ruined it? Niman, or Form VI, was created as a great synthesis, a bridge between the philosophies of all the forms that had come before it. It borrowed from Shicho's broad strikes, from Makashi's grace, from Sarisu's patience, from Ataru's speed, and Xian's counters, and from Jem So's raw power. It was meant to unite them, to make a Jedi adaptable, balanced, complete, and on paper, it succeeded. But the Jedi misunderstood what balance meant. They turned Niman into an act of moderation, a form that allowed them to avoid excess, to dabble in every discipline without committing to any. They called it the diplomat's form because it was the safe option, the form for peacekeepers, negotiators, and scholars who believed the lightsaber was only a last resort. In doing so, they drained it of what made it powerful. They built a style meant to conquer chaos, and in the fear of it, stripped away everything that could make it thrive. At the Battle of Geonosis, that mistake became legend. Hundreds of Jedi flooded into the arena, warriors of the Republic, defenders of peace, and nearly all who practiced Niman died in minutes. They died not because their form was flawed, but because they were. They used Niman as a shield, not as a weapon. They had trained for control, for harmony, for restraint, and faced an enemy that only cared for victory. To the Sith, Niman was freedom. To the Jedi was permission. Permission to stop trying, to call mediocrity balance. The very form designed to make a Jedi limitless became a cage that they willingly would lock themselves inside. But there is another way to look at Form VI, one that the Jedi never could. Because in the hands of the obsessed, the ambitious, and the unrestrained, Niman became something else entirely. It became a form of creation, a form of destruction, and no one embodied that quality more than the Sith who perfected it. Today, my fellow lore junkies, we will be talking about how the Jedi ruined Form VI, gave it a reputation as being the weakest of all of the lightsaber forms. Every single individual Jedi that specialized in Form VI would be gunned down during the Battle of Geonosis. Their vulnerabilities and weaknesses lay bare for the entire galaxy to see. For the first time in centuries, the Jedi were mortal. But we don't believe that this reputation for Form VI is fair, because the Sith proved that there is so much more to Niman than the Jedi are ever willing to accept. And today, we have three perfect examples. If the Jedi turned Niman into a cage, Exar Kun was the first to shatter the lock. Where the Jedi saw Niman as compromise, Kun saw it as liberation, a form that didn't tell him what to do, but what he could do. And for someone like him, that freedom was intoxicating. Exar wasn't just a warrior, he was a sadist. He believed that a duel wasn't won when your enemy was dead, it was won when your enemy realized that they never stood a chance. He fought not to kill, but to humiliate. Every duel was theater, every opponent an audience to his supremacy. That's why Niman suited him perfectly. Unlike the rigid precision of Makashi or the disciplined defenses of Sarisu, Niman was a blank slate, a form that could absorb anything and become anything. It rewarded imagination, deception, and confidence, and no one in the galaxy had more of those traits than Exar Kun. Exar treated the form as a lab for breaking the rules. He pioneered techniques that would make the Jedi Masters of his era recoil in disgust. Trakata, the forbidden practice of deactivating and reactivating the lightsaber mid-swing to bypass defenses or strike from impossible angles. Exar engineered the first dual-bladed lightsaber capable of altering its length and activation at will. Against a single-blade duelist, it was chaos incarnate. Exar could feint with one end and strike with the other before his enemy even realized what had happened. To the Jedi, such tactics were dishonorable. To Kun, honor was an illusion, a weakness masquerading as a virtue. He believed the only true morality was victory, and Niman gave him every tool he needed for that victory. Each duel became a study in exploitation, testing how far he could twist an enemy's expectations before they broke. Exar saw Form VI as an infinite pool of deception, a way to redefine combat itself. Where others sought form, he only ever sought control. He was a sculptor of chaos, carving unpredictability into a weapon so elegant that it looked effortless. He could shift from his wide arcs of Shicho to the thrusts of Makashi, or explode into the airborne fury of Ataru, all within seconds, all without warning. But beneath all that artistry was cruelty. Every move he made was designed to expose, to taunt, to erode confidence. He wanted his enemies to feel small, to realize in the moment before death that their codes and their traditions betrayed them. Exar Kun didn't just master Niman, he corrupted it. He took the form that the Jedi had neutered with moderation and turned it into a display of dominance, not balance, not harmony, but ego unbound. And yet he was only the beginning, because centuries later another figure would approach Form VI from the opposite end of the spectrum, not driven by cruelty or pride, but for knowledge. A man whose obsession was not with humiliation, but with understanding. That man was Revan. If Exar Kun twisted Niman into a weapon of deception, Revan refined it into an instrument of understanding. Revan's obsession wasn't control or cruelty, it was knowledge. He was a man who believed that the Force was an endless puzzle, one that could never be solved, only understood more completely. And for that reason, Form VI was his natural language. Where other forms demanded commitment to precision, defense, or power, Niman demanded perspective. It allowed the duelist to stand between all the philosophies, to draw from them as needed, to adapt not just to the enemy, but to the nature of the conflict itself. To the Jedi, this meant safety, a way to fight without falling into obsession. But to Revan, it meant something greater, freedom through knowledge. From the moment he first picked up a lightsaber, Revan studied every form that he could find. He mastered them, analyzed them, and discarded their limitations. When Exar used Niman to exploit, Revan used it to evolve. He viewed every duel as a lesson, every failure as data, every opponent as a teacher. What set Revan apart was how he merged the Force and the blade into a single rhythm, one of the strengths of Form VI that is severely underutilized. For most Jedi, the lightsaber and the Force were separate disciplines, one of skill and one of spirit. Revan rejected the separation. His combat style blurred the line completely. Telekinesis and lightning became natural extensions of his swings. Every strike carried kinetic force. Every parry rippled with invisible energy. He would hurl debris mid-duel, alter an opponent's balance through subtle telekinetic pressure, or unleash bursts of raw power to redirect an incoming blow. To fight Revan was to fight the Force. And yet, despite his power, his approach was never born of rage. Revan was curious, not wrathful. Inquisitive where Exar Kun was sadistic. His mastery came not from hunger, but from discipline and intellect. Where Exar fought to humiliate his enemy, Revan fought to understand them. In Niman, he found a reflection of himself, adaptable, analytical, patient, but endlessly ambitious. Revan understood what fellow Jedi never could, that Niman was not a compromise, it was a mirror, a form that revealed what the user valued the most. When practiced without passion, it produced mediocrity. When practiced with intellect, it produced balance. And when paired with obsession, whether Exar's or Revan's curiosity, it would produce mastery. To Revan, Niman was never about winning a duel. It was about achieving harmony between the thought and the action, a state where every movement carried purpose and every strike deepened understanding. Through that, he reached something neither Jedi nor Sith could claim. Revan achieved unity. But the Order never learned from Revan. To the Jedi, he was a cautionary tale, not a student of the Force, but a heretic. They saw in his innovation defiance, in his curiosity danger, and in that fear they buried his lessons along with his name. They forgot what Niman could be, and in doing so, they destroyed the Form's legacy. There still exists a version of a Sith who wielded Form VI to absolute mastery that we haven't discussed yet. Each one of these Sith, though, have mastered Form VI to a different degree with a different philosophy. All of them proof, though, that it is possible. Next, we have Darth Krayt. If Revan represented Niman's intellect, then Darth Krayt was its reckoning. The proof of what happens when the same philosophy will live two lives. Long before he became the self-proclaimed Dark Lord of the One Sith, Krayt was Asherad Het, a Jedi Master who wielded Niman in its Jar Kai variant, the art of dual blades. Unlike the scholars and the diplomats who hid behind the form as balance, Het lived by the sword. During the Clone Wars, he was one of the few Jedi whose combat skill was undeniable. While others used Form VI as an excuse to avoid specialization, he used it as a bridge between instinct and precision. He weaved two blades into a single rhythm, fighting with a fluidity and ferocity that the Order rarely allowed itself to acknowledge. When Order 66 came, that mastery would save him. Where thousands of Jedi fell in seconds, Het cut his way out of death itself. He survived an event designed specifically to annihilate his kind. He proved that the form the Jedi had dismissed as inadequate could, in the hands of a true master, stand among the most lethal in the galaxy. And yet even then, something was missing. When he later faced Obi-Wan Kenobi on the sands of Tatooine, the duel revealed something deeper to Het than defeat. By this point, he was no longer the Jedi that the Order had raised. He had already abandoned their restraint, their fear of passion. He had become something else entirely, but not a Sith. Not yet. That was his flaw. Asherad fought that day without the discipline of the Jedi or the conviction of the dark side. He had cast off serenity, but he had not yet learned to wield hatred. He fought between worlds, hollow, uncertain, and unfinished. His movements had skill, but no fury, precision, but no dominance. And against Kenobi, whose lightsaber carried both clarity and compassion, the emptiness was fatal. The loss became a rebirth. Years later, when he shed his name and became Darth Krayt, the transformation was absolute. The missing element, the raw devouring current of the dark side, finally filled the void that had haunted him since Tatooine. The same form that had once been graceful and balanced became a weapon of an empire. Every motion carried purpose, every strike authority. Through Niman, Krayt no longer sought balance, he sought submission. He introduced the one ingredient that had always eluded him: hatred. Not blind rage, but cold, directed fury. The kind that binds the Force itself to one's will. He learned what the Jedi never could, that passion was not corruption, it was completion. And in that realization, his form evolved in turn. As a Jedi, Asherad Het had survived the war that had killed his peers. As a Sith, Darth Krayt survived death itself. Through the dark side, he extended his life beyond nature, reshaping his body and his order into reflections of his hunger. His Niman became a mirror of the Empire, unified, unrelenting, and built to last for eternity. Krayt proved what no Jedi ever could, that Niman's strength lies not in balance, but in totality, of the merging of every form, of every philosophy, every emotion into one. He achieved what the Jedi called impossible, because he embraced what they feared the most. Like Revan before him, Darth Krayt will deserve his own place in the GOAT debate, but for now his legacy stands as the clearest truth of all. The Jedi's Niman sought balance, and the Sith's Niman became power. By the time of the Clone Wars, it would be fair to say that the Jedi no longer practiced Niman, but they rather had hollowed it out. What had once been designed as the great synthesis of the seven forms became a polite formality, a symbolic gesture towards versatility rather than true understanding. Form VI was supposed to be the bridge between philosophies, the discipline that allowed a warrior to weave the Force and motion into one perfect expression. But in the hands of the Jedi, it became something smaller. They turned the form of infinite possibility into a form of avoidance. They called it balance, they called it moderation, but what they really meant was fear. Fear of obsession, fear of passion, fear of losing control. So they redefined mastery into something safe, something that would never threaten them or test them. And in doing so, they destroyed the very thing that made Niman worth mastering. The community debates are right about one thing: Niman is the easiest form to learn and the hardest to master. It's not meant to be specialized, it's meant to integrate. You can learn its basics quickly, but to reach true mastery, you must understand every other form deeply enough to merge them without hesitation. Most Jedi do not have the ambition for that. They train to be competent, not to be transcendent. The Sith, meanwhile, thrive in the space the Jedi fear to enter. Exar embraced the deception, breaking every rule of combat until rules themselves bent around his will. Revan turned intellect into harmony, blending every discipline into a seamless language of thought and motion. And Krayt lived the transformation, proving that Niman without passion is survival, but Niman with the dark side is immortality. That was the difference. The Jedi studied forms to preserve peace, the Sith mastered them to command it. The Jedi saw the Force as something to serve, the Sith saw it as something to master. Because Niman was the form of everything, it responded to whoever demanded everything from it. That's why the same form that failed the Jedi built the greatest duelists in galactic history. They all found Niman as a mirror. For the timid, it reflected balance. For the brilliant, it could reflect infinity. For the ambitious, it reflected power beyond comprehension. The Jedi call it the diplomat's form. But in truth, diplomacy is only useful to those afraid to win. The Sith took that same foundation and made it a form of conquest. In the end, the Jedi didn't just misunderstand Niman, they ruined it. They stripped it of passion, of experimentation, and of danger. They took the art of mastery and turned it into a symbol of restraint. They turned a language of creativity into silence and rules. But the Sith remembered what the Jedi would forget. They remembered that the Force was not balance, it was motion. It is the will to evolve, to expand, and to dominate. And so every time a Sith Lord drew their blade, Exar Kun, Revan, Sidious, Krayt, the same truth repeated. Niman was never weak. It simply waited for someone unafraid to perfect it. Because balance is not peace. Balance is power and equilibrium, and only those willing to break it will ever master it. But as always, my friends and lore junkies, did this help recontextualize the way that you look at Form VI Niman, the form that many fans consider to be the weakest of all of the classical lightsaber forms, and yet in actuality may be one of the strongest, if not the strongest at its apex? But I'll leave that debate up to you guys in the comments down below. As always, my friends, thank you so much for joining us in the archives here today, and may the Force be with you.